In this video, we will be focusing on the big picture themes of European history from 1450 to the modern age. I will not be focusing on the details because that would result in a really long and really boring video. The year 1450 lands us right in the middle of a time period known as the Renaissance. There were two phases of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance came first and was centered in Florence, a city-state run by the Medici family. The major trends and ideas that sprung from the Italian Renaissance included humanism, individualism, and secularism. While people actively engaged in the Renaissance believed themselves to be returning to classical styles of thought, they were actually coming up with revolutionary ideas that would fuel modern European history. This was especially true for art, where artists such as the Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, and Raphael flourished. The Northern Renaissance came a bit later than the Italian Renaissance, approximately from 1450 to 1600, and it shared many traits with the Italian Renaissance, especially in the form of new ideas. The Northern Renaissance is more centered on Christianity than its Italian counterpart, and the art was also very different. Northern Renaissance art focused more on the common man in everyday life. Jan van Eyck and Peter Bruegel were major artists of this time. Next, I'll speak about the Reformation. The giant of the Reformation is really Martin Luther, who initiated the movement with his 95 Theses. Luther went against the Catholic Church, and this caused others, such as John Calvin, to split from the Catholic Church as well and form new sects of Christianity. The Catholic Church's response to the Reformation was the Counter-Reformation, which included reform of the Catholic Church and the sponsoring of Baroque art. The Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe and eventually led to a number of wars that started based off of religion. It also led to the separation of religion and the state. The power of the Catholic Church was also greatly reduced. Next, we are going to look at the Age of Exploration. This era was initiated with the circumnavigation of Africa and the building of the Portuguese trading post empire, which controlled the spice trade in India and Asia. Then Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, which drastically altered the focus of the Age of Exploration. The Spanish and Portuguese both started to rapidly explore and exploit the New World, which led to the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Spain became the leading power on the globe, controlling all areas marked in red on the map shown. The Spanish silver became the dominant form of currency, and it also allowed for the Europeans to trade with China. Moving on to absolutism, which was the leading form of government at this time. This era centralized power within the monarch and decreased the power of the nobility. Absolute monarchs determined the religious and secular policies of their countries, and the phrase "L'état c'est moi," said by our favorite absolute monarch Louis XIV, basically sums up the ideals of absolutism. Monarchs believed to rule by the grace of God, and they ruled by the divine right of kings. The art of this time period was dedicated to the glorification of the monarch. Looking at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we can see that reason and scientific processes played a dominant role in the attitudes of this time period. There were many essential breakthroughs in the scientific fields as well as in political and economic theory. The popularizers of these theories were known as philosophers, and they would meet in salons hosted by aristocratic ladies. The major philosophers of the Enlightenment were Rousseau, Voltaire, Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu. What really made the Enlightenment a successful movement was not actually the philosophers themselves, but monarchs known as enlightened despots, who supported the philosophers. The enlightened despots of this age made many reforms that opened up the government, but they did not make any reforms that would restrain their own power as a monarch. The logic and rationality that dominated this age also led to the ending of the belief in the divine right of kings that was prominent in the Age of Absolutism. Now, I just want to take a moment to explain that the periods of history I've just spoken about overlapped quite a bit. Most people consider history to be very clear-cut eras, but in reality, it looks a bit more like this. Alright, let's take a closer look at France. At this time, King Louis XVI was in power, along with his wife Marie Antoinette. France was facing extreme debt, and the people it fell hardest upon was the majority, who were already facing extreme poverty. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that the French people rebelled after a particularly bad political blunder made by the king while he had called the States General. The French Revolution of 1789 was started with the tennis court oath, and, to be frank, it alarmed monarchs across Europe. Climaxing in the Reign of Terror, which is infamous for its use of the guillotine, the French Revolution quickly collapsed on itself, leaving a weak government, the Directory, in charge of France. The Directory did not hold its power for long. Napoleon Bonaparte, the leading general of France, launched a successful coup in 1799, becoming the first consul of France. He then proceeded to crown himself Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon's military tactics allowed him to conquer or control most of Europe, and he ensured the rapid spread of the ideals of the French Revolution, as well as of his own policies. It took Europe 2 tries to depose Napoleon, but they finally managed it with a massive alliance at his final defeat in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. After Napoleon's fall, the Bourbons were reinstated as a puppet monarchy on the French throne, and the affairs of Europe were settled through the extremely conservative Congress of Vienna, which was headed by the Austrian Clemens von Metternich. The Congress of Vienna was a very conservative force, but at this time, liberalism and revolutionary spirit throughout Europe was rising. Moving on to a different sort of revolution, I'm going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, which was a time of extreme exploitation. A population boom had occurred due to the agricultural revolution, and there were many people in extreme poverty. They were the factory workers. The factories were focused on making as much profit as possible, and it paid little or no attention to the human cost that the factory system extolled. Great Britain led the way in the Industrial Revolution, and if we look at the geography of the island nation, we can see why. Great Britain has abundant resources of coal, iron, and hydropower, all of which were essentials in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution contained an intense polarization between the rich and the poor, and rampant diseases due to unsanitary living conditions. The Industrial Revolution is incredibly important because it altered man's sense of time and distance. Now things could be accomplished at a much swifter pace, and a person could travel much faster, and therefore farther, due to the new use of machinery. A group of people, known as Luddites, tried to resist the revolution by breaking machinery. They were primarily made up of the artisans that the machinery ousted. Poor wages, hideously hazardous working conditions, and child labor were all major features of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't until the Factory Act of 1833 that some of the working conditions got better, particularly for children. The Industrial Revolution is what opened the door for every technological advance that fuels the world we live in today. Now, about the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. The majority of these were complete failures, with the exceptions of Serbia, Greece, and Belgium, who all received support from other European nations, who looked to gain from their independence. These revolutions were caused by a rising sense of nationalism within the people of Europe, particularly in the minorities who were dissatisfied with the Congress of Vienna's reconfiguration of Europe. Napoleon had spread ideals from the French Revolution all over the world, and the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were the result. It's like how if you spread grease all over your face, you'll have a major breakout. This was Europe's breakout. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 may have been mostly failures, but they did set the stage for the unifications of Germany and Italy, which were very important because they changed the balance of power in Europe. Since the Congress of Vienna, the name of the game in Europe had been balance between the major powers. But the unification of Italy and Germany completely threw that out the window. The unification of Italy was, in all honesty, really due to the expansionism of Piedmont Sardinia under King Victor Emmanuel II and his advisor Cavour. The dedication of Garibaldi to the cause of a unified Italy was also crucial to the unification of the Mediterranean Peninsula, which was finalized in 1861 when King Victor Emmanuel II was crowned King of all Italy. Looking a bit northwards, we can see that Germany finally pulls itself together and unifies, but only under the expert manipulation of Chancellor Bismarck. Bismarck had a mind for strategy and was perpetually 2 steps ahead of the opponents of the unification of Germany. He ensured that Prussia unified Germany through his war with Austria, and then he finished off the unification process through the Franco-Prussian War. It helped that the Germanic states had desired unity for decades, which had been denied to them by the Congress of Vienna, and they also already shared a currency and a language. Following the unifications of Germany and Italy was the Belle Epoque in the age of imperialism. Globalization really took off at this time, with countries making colonies all over the place. The leader of overseas expansion and colonization was hands down Great Britain. The British Empire reached its height during the reign of King Edward VII, where it held 1/4 of the world's landmass. King Edward VII was the successor of England's longest reigning queen, Queen Victoria. The entire 19th century is known as the Victorian era due to her 64-year-long reign in England during this time period. Along with worldwide colonies and nationalism came European arrogance and racism. The attitudes of this time period are very accurately portrayed in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which argued that it is the duty of Europeans to colonize and educate the inhabitants of other continents. The world's first machine gun, called the Maxim gun, was also invented during this time, which allowed for the scramble of Africa to occur. Asia was also carved up by European spheres of influence, which is a form of indirect control that was often used as a form of colonization. Every European nation considered themselves as superior to all other forms of humanity on the planet, and this attitude is prevalent in World War I and World War II as well. During this era, the suffragette movement also occurred in Britain, but it was not successful until after World War I had ended. World War I started for a variety of reasons. The acronym MANIA sums them up: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. The A for assassination refers to when Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, was killed by Gavrilo Princip in 1914. Princip was part of a terrorist group called the Black Hand, who went to any and every extreme to achieve a greater Serbia. This assassination caused Austria and Serbia to go to war. Alliances swiftly dragged in many more countries, starting the First Global War. World War I became a war of attrition due to the tactics of trench warfare and the repeated assaults into no man's land. The term lions led by donkeys accurately describes the tactics of World War I, in which the courage of the soldiers ended up with them becoming part of a massive casualty statistic. World War I was also the first total war, where civilian life became oriented around supporting the war effort. Propaganda was also heavily employed by the governments to keep people's morale and fighting spirit running high. The major turning point of the war was when the United States joined the fight in 1917, assisting the Allies against the Central Powers. The war was over a year later, and the Treaty of Versailles was declared in 1919. The Treaty of Versailles was a special document that had been dithered over for a year and yet still managed to please absolutely no one. The treaty set up alliances for World War II because of how Japan, Italy, and Germany lost money and resources from it. Now let's take a quick look at Russia, who had to leave World War I early to deal with its own revolution in 1917. The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Tsar and created a communist government to control Russia. After Lenin died, Joseph Stalin seized power, becoming the dictator of Russia in 1922. This time between the two world wars is called the Age of Anxiety, and during this age, Hitler and Mussolini both came to power. Mussolini is also credited with founding the political theory of fascism, which relied on warfare and fear to enforce a totalitarian dictatorship. World War II started in 1939, when Neville Chamberlain declared war on Germany because of Hitler's invasion of Poland. Hitler had been getting away with many smaller violations of the Treaty of Versailles, but this was too much, especially because England and France had guaranteed Poland's safety. The Axis powers, which were Germany, Japan, and Italy, quickly found themselves facing off against England, France, and all of their colonies scattered across the world. Russia had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and the USA was practicing isolationism. Both countries later became involved due to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and the German invasion of Russia. In the end, the Allies won World War II with the unconditional surrender of Germany and the surrenders of both Japan and Italy. The United Nations also replaced the League of Nations that had been formed after World War I. Germany was also split into two major parts, the East and the West, as was Berlin. The western portion of Germany was also split into smaller occupation zones that were occupied by different countries, but for simplicity's sake, I will refer to them as West Germany and West Berlin. Looking forward, I'm going to speak on the Cold War, which is the term that refers to the extreme tension and competition that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. It's called the Cold War because it didn't break out into full-fledged armed conflict, at least not in Europe anyway. The world was divided between the Soviet and American spheres of influence, with any neutral countries expected to choose a side. The space race and the nuclear arms race were both important parts of the Cold War, particularly the nuclear arms race because it meant that humanity has the means to ensure its own destruction. Cold War continued until the Soviet policies of glasnost and perestroika, which were put into place by Mikhail Gorbachev, started allowing for more Soviet freedoms. This swiftly led to the downfall of communism, with all the countries that had previously made up the communist bloc transitioning away from communism. Some of these transitions occurred peacefully, while others involved a bit more brutal violence. The ultimate symbol of the end of the Cold War was the falling of the Berlin Wall, which occurred in 1989. Moving on, decolonization was also an important theme of the Cold War time period, with many European countries losing their colonies on different continents. Globalization expanded through the United Nations, the World Bank, and other such unifying corporations. This globalization is why the modern world looks the way it does, with imports and exports between countries occurring nearly every day. Modern society and the lifestyles of the modern man are defined and exhibited by globalization. Alright, well, I've basically given you an AP Euro 101, and we have found ourselves in the present day, so this video is now concluded.